Welcome. Welcome everyone to the opening session of Chatham House's virtual conference, Iraq, Navigating Reform, Collapse, and the Status Quo. My name is Lina Khatib. I'm the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. And it's a pleasure to be hosting you for this conference, which is part of Chatham House's Iraq Initiative project. For those of you who are not familiar with the project, it's a fieldwork-based policy project that aims to rethink the nature of state building and governance in Iraq. The project tackles the root causes of state failure to challenge assumptions held mainly in Western capitals about stabilization and peace building, and reach more nuanced approaches to navigating Iraq's complex and interlinked political, security, and economic environment. This project is run by my colleague, Dr. Renald Mansour. As for our conference, every session in the conference is on the record and is being recorded. And as an audience, you are all encouraged to tweet during the event using the hashtag Iraq Initiative. And you can also submit questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. And please do feel free to submit the questions anytime. It is my absolute pleasure to chair in this opening session His Excellency Ali Allawi, who really needs no introduction. He is Iraq's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, having served in different capacities in the government previously, and who at the moment is tackling complex challenges in Iraq today that he will cover in his opening remarks. So, Your Excellency, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Lina, and thank you for all the participants to this webinar. It's very difficult to summarize Iraq's problems, legacy issues, and issues that have emerged in the last year, last decade, and actually since, I would say, since the 1960s. There has been a series of very significant economic issues that have been left untended, and they have accumulated and they have turned into what I would call an existential economic crisis that we are facing now. These issues, it's easy to try to link them to the changeover in 2003 and to the various markers of corruption and maladministration and political infighting and the security situation and so on. Obviously, they have a direct impact on the political economy of the country, but the legacy issues of this country should not be underestimated. And the fact that they have been left untackled for so long is part of the problem that we have. Sometimes I start my comments by going back to the 1950s, and people start yawning. But the reason I do that is just to give examples. For example, the agrarian reform law, which was done in the late 50s, possibly with the best of intentions, but ended up saddling the country now with really an unworkable land tenure laws. The absence of a private sector and all this talk about empowering the private sector and so on. The fact of the matter is that the private sector was decimated in the 1960s. We had a very thriving corporate culture there, probably the most advanced in the Middle East. We had also quite a large foreign investor community here, which was not involved just in the oil and gas sector, but was involved in nearly across the board, from financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, consumer goods manufacturers, trading houses, and so on. We talk about the size of the state and its relationship to the economy and so on. This is really a legacy issue of the 1970s and the explosion in oil revenues and the continuing encroachment of the state on the private realm. Into the 1980s, the Iraq-Iran war and the war economy and the legacy issues that we face today. I mean, as of now, we still haven't paid off the restructured public debt of nearly $150 billion. We still have something like 20 odd billion outstanding. You talk about the issues of Kuwait and the Kuwait this is the last year in which we'll be paying reparations. So this has been gone and been a drag on the oil revenues for a very long time. The 1990s and the siege economy, we were under sanctions, and a large number of institutions and the entire culture of state subsidies in order, I suppose, to provide a basic living standard for people, safety net. But we have to deal with the legacy issues, from subsidized food products to oil products to rents and all of that, free electricity. And then the chaos and the confusion in economic policy since 2003, which all of this has culminated in the crisis that we face now. And the crisis that we have now is really, I think, an existential one, unless and until oil prices move up to beyond, say, $70 for a sustained period. We have to face all of these issues on a sort of incremental basis as we move into 2021. So when this government was formed, the first order was to try to take a stock of what needs to be done from a strategy and policy perspective. And we spent many hundreds, if not thousands of man hours coming up with what we call the white paper, which is really both an analysis of the Iraqi economy and why we ended up in this situation through macroeconomic assessments, and then a whole series of proposals governing specific sectors in the economy, not least the institutions that guide and direct economic policy, which is mainly the Ministry of Finance. And as a result of this white paper, which has become the formal government position on change in the economy, and we hope it will be institutionalized, either through legislation or in the form of specific entities empowered with implementing the changes that we recommended. These changes have not yet been put out into the public arena, but they are only because they amount to nearly 450 specific changes in laws, decrees, regulations, changes in policy, and so on. And it is really a mammoth task to try to put this economy and to put it back on the right track towards growth and development and giving its people a fair chance for securing a relatively acceptable and high standard of living. There are distortions in every single aspect of the Iraqi economy, and there isn't really a magic solution, except sustained and continuous implementation of reform, radical where possible, piecemeal when necessary, in an institutional and political framework that I must say is not very hospitable. So this is really the background. I was asked to give a small intervention, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions or any observations and comments that have been made. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I mean, obviously, you rightly note that a lot of the problems that Iraq is facing today are not new. They are problems that are inherited. And as you said, these are also mentioned in the white paper that talks about how things that Iraq is suffering from now need a long-term strategy to be resolved. The issue, though, is where is this strategy? I mean, you mentioned 450 measures need to be taken. I mean, I looked at the white paper, and although the roadmap is clear, the actual steps that need to be taken are still a bit uncertain to a lot of people. So perhaps might you be able to just offer some examples of some of the concrete measures that can be implemented in Iraq realistically, let's say in the next 6 months or so, especially that the country is meant to be preparing for elections during this time?
Well, as I said earlier, there really are no quick solutions. If there were, we'd be using them, we'd be employing them now. But what we have, I mean, I'll just give you an example. The Ministry of Finance, which is the entity concerned with managing the economy, we need to make changes at all levels, at the levels of automation, of customs, at the level of introducing IT systems, at the level of moving from manual to IT-based systems for payrolls and for pensions, at the level of recruitment, at the level of improving the quality and training of the staff, at the level of consolidating the units here and putting them under stronger administrative, centralized administrative control, pushing the budget and the financial controls throughout the government. These are specific measures that if you're looking for an entity that can manage an economy, the first thing it must do is to reform itself. So this is an example. Another example is the electricity sector. I mean, people have been talking about it for so long. It is such an intricate web of interlocking interests that is, in order for us to untangle them, to find out why is it that the electricity sector is not distributing electricity and receiving payment for it. Why are we still dependent on gas imports from Iran? Why are we still not linked up to the networks of other countries? Why do we still have confusion as to what the IPP rules are? You need to look at all of these, one after the other, so that the final change has some meaning. I have said before that a lot of these problems are interlocking, and wherever there is an issue that requires resolution, there's bound to be some vested interest, sometimes extremely powerful, that stop this from happening. People say, well, go after low-hanging fruit. There really is no such thing as low-hanging fruit if the entire environment around you is to a very large extent devastated. If you look at, for example, our policy towards gas, the utilization of gas, where it should go, should we burn it? Should we use it as a feedstock for petrochemicals? What should our be in terms of alternatives? What should we do with the various gas contracts that have been put out there without any takers? So these require very detailed assessment at each and every level to bring them up to, I won't say just best international standard, but to bring them up to an acceptable standard where they begin to return more than they consume. Take agriculture, for example. People talk about Iraq as being, there's a great opportunity. There is a great opportunity in agriculture. There's no doubt about it. But if you look at it in terms of what are the specific policies for water management, what are the specific policies to incentivize farmers, what is the cost of doing that? The cost of subsidizing our agriculture approaches something like 10% of the budget. Now, is this something that we can sustain for much longer in a realm of in a time of retreating oil prices? There aren't really any very quick wins. What we can do and what we will do is to focus on those sectors that are the most bleeding, let's say, that are hemorrhaging, and in particular the electricity sector, where we have to do something very, very quickly. We also have to face up to the fact that the structure of public expenditures is simply unsupportable. So we have to move against, unfortunately, in the 2021 budget, against the allowances and salaries of the higher echelons of the civil service, and so on. If you add all of these changes, they amount to a huge mountain of required changes. I'm confident that they will be done if there is continuous effort to sustain them with the political will to implement them. I think it's not an impossible task. It's a difficult task, but not impossible.
Thank you. I mean, basically, you're proposing austerity measures, and then you mentioned the issue of political will, and I also threw in the issue of elections looming. How will anyone win elections when they are seen as supporting salary cuts? How do you also get political buy-in when you're proposing measures that also may not necessarily be acceptable by all the political class?
Well, the argument I'm using really is that there's no alternative. We've been living far, far beyond our means for a long time. All these problems have been hidden by high oil revenues. But the problem is not just high oil revenues. The problem, obviously, is gross mismanagement and corruption and so on. But it is true, it's a political conundrum. I mean, it is not the best of times to introduce radical reforms. But the options are really very, very limited that we have now. On the assumption that oil prices don't move up, something somewhere has to give. Either we follow a sort of a Venezuelan course of an oil economy that goes belly up, or we tighten our belts. Now, tightening, nobody's going to be for it. But there is, I must say, a kind of recognition, maybe sort of subliminal, that things have to change. And there is far greater willingness to accept some belt tightening than there was, at least from the beginning of the year when I came on the scene. So it seems that this message, which we're constantly repeating, and the salary crisis that we've had in the last 3 months, you may be aware of it, that there was insufficient liquidity to pay government salaries and we had to go into arrears. This had to be, this has left some sense that, you know, the band has to stop playing at some point. But it's difficult, I accept it, politically.
Yeah, I mean, politically, Iraq has been ruled by an elite pact, and this elite pact, in a way, funds itself through the existing status quo. What's the prospect for the elite pact when there is less money to go around?
Well, I compare it to a kind of lake in Africa, and like these National Geographic series, where the dry season comes, the water shrinks and the fish become more frenzied. This is what's happening now, is that the elite pact has to deal with what you call the elite pact, has to deal with shrinking water. The oxygen level is reducing. And there's a lot of, you know, not knowing how to extract rents from this dwindling pool. It requires, I must say, that somebody has to say no at some point. And I suppose this has fallen to me to say no, but you can only say no up to a point. Then they will say no to you. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues that we are working on at Chatham House is to do with border dynamics. And my colleague Lina Mansour, who leads our Iraq initiative, pointed out to me that Iraq was expecting $8 billion from customs. However, the sum received was only an eighth of that. And when you think about which groups basically benefit from border transactions, and here we're talking, you know, a wide variety of groups, a lot of these groups are also linked to the state. So you're kind of in a bit of a loophole when it comes to trying to reform, but then you have people with vested interests.
Well, a lot of these problems are due to really very, very poor administration and their management issues. Not all of them, some of them are management issues. Something like a third of our imports comes through the so-called northern border posts, which actually means that the KRG collects these and keeps them. So I have no control over them at this point. So these are continuous, contentious issues. The other border posts, you're absolutely right. I mean, they're riddled with corruption, and to the point where minor clerks in some outpost, the jobs there change for $50,000, $100,000 just to be, and sometimes it goes up to multiples of that. So it's all riddled. I agree with you, and the outcome is that we have a fraction of what we collect, something like 10% of our headline customs. What we should collect. Jordan collects something more like 97%. So you can see the gap. But I think the gap we have to tackle, first of all, technically, we have to find technical solutions to it. And then politically, the politics are able to insinuate themselves into the huge cracks that exist in the administrative machinery. If these are closed, and we're about to start closing them, it's we're about to sign up with UNCTAD to introduce their customs automation system. Each of these will slice a layer off, and until people, you know, go public about it, say we expect you not to do this. Everybody is for customs modernization. We will probably be able to increase our, you know, customs revenue by maybe 100% in the next maybe 18 months after the automation is introduced, and so on. So incrementally, you go up, and it becomes more costly for them to try to control that particular, so they move somewhere else. And if we shrink that space over time, reform can happen in a sort of pseudo-democracy that we have here.
I'm going to start taking some questions from our audience, and there's a few. Mayesh Bailey from AFP is asking that she's keen to hear how you and the broader cabinet have been working to resolve the political challenges to implementing your ambitious reform plan. She's asking specifically, who do you need on your side and what will it take to get them there?
Well, the cabinet has approved it, so I mean, we've crossed that bridge, thankfully. The issue is now, how do you introduce the reforms, what we call the white paper, in institutionalized form? We're working on that now. We're working on the structures that have some kind of continuity. And what we need, I think, is possibly a separate entity, not necessarily a ministry, but a separate entity that is led by a good, dynamic person that has enough political will and power behind it to start sort of seeding the reform throughout the government. The main problem that we have now is how do you, we're introducing the reforms into the budget. So passing the budget law is one way of, as it were, legislating and institutionalizing the reform. I don't think we need a special reform law that would sort of adopt the white paper. The other thing I must say is that we have significant international backing for it from something called the International Economic Contact Group for Iraq, which is the G7 plus a few other countries. And this group has been particularly supporting. And in as much as they can affect the political environment in parliament, they will do so. So that's another angle that we're looking at. The third angle is that really it seems that a lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon of reform. So the white paper hasn't had many critics, to be honest. Substantially, haven't had any critics. Maybe because not many people have read it, and because it's so detailed and so technical. The critics have been mainly non-Iraqis or abroad, from abroad. So that's another thing. The main issue is not how do you get buy-in into it now, because everybody is, one way or the other, is either neutral or neutral to positive about it. Some are neutral to negative. But how do you institutionalize it? And we're working on that. And we hope we'll come up with a structure that will ensure stability and continuity of reform post this parliament and into new governments.
Thank you. There are questions to do with the budget and the financial situation more generally. I'm going to take them together. One is Iraq planning to borrow internationally through, for example, the IMF or others? And the other question is, what is Iraq's membership in OPEC going to look like? UAE apparently, allegedly, is entertaining an exit. Do you think Iraq might do the same?
On the borrowing side, I mean, we have been approached by investment banks as usual, sort of fly around distressed areas. I don't think we have that much borrowing capacity on the open markets. Maybe a few $100 million, maybe up to $1 billion, but it's certainly insufficient to meet our funding needs. And the cost will be prohibitive. I mean, the Iraq bond now trades at around 8% yield to maturity. We're looking at a domestic dollar bond issue aimed at the domestic market. There's quite a lot of dollars, various currencies, but mainly dollars held in households in cash form. The estimates can be up to 40 billion, maybe exaggerated that number, but we're intending to tap into that. The IMF, we're discussing with them just now in broad terms the possibility of this. They have this something called RFI, Rapid Finance Instrument, which will basically, it's mainly aimed at supporting countries affected by the coronavirus thing. Well, the world is, but the effect of the coronavirus on the economy. That would lead to the extended financing facility, which is some kind of agreement on a reform package. We're in constant discussions with that. We're approaching in a sort of systematic way towards perhaps borrowing from the IMF maybe beginning of next year. But the funds, as I said, from them are not that significant, will not be that to plug the gap. Neither will they unlock markets coming in. Our debt capacity ratios are still reasonably good, but next year they'll be moving into yellow, and not red, but yellow territory, so flashing yellow lights. Regarding OPEC, it's true. I mean, I was for a while Minister of Oil, acting Minister of Oil for a month in the early days of this government. And I attended 2 or 3 of these OPEC virtual meetings. And my contention, and was my last statement, is that Iraq we should not accept the one-size-fits-all model that's being followed now, being pursued now. The Ministry of Oil is responsible for the OPEC relationship, but obviously, so what I'm saying is really maybe just as it affects us. I don't particularly think that it is correct to apply this, especially over a long period of time, the OPEC cutbacks, without taking into account the economic, social, demographic, and political conditions of each country. So it has to be far more nuanced if it's going to be sustained. The potential exit of UAE from OPEC, the Libyans coming in up to maybe 1.5 million barrels a day. I think all of that are sort of disruptive factors that need to be tackled by OPEC. The costs of leaving OPEC are relatively clear. I mean, which is loss of control over the market and collapse in oil prices. I mean, it's not going to affect oil demand; it's going to affect prices. Staying in OPEC, we have reached. I think, as an Iraqi official, I would say that we have reached the limit of our ability and willingness to accept a policy of one size fits all. It has to be more nuanced and has to be related to the per capita income of people, the presence of sovereign wealth funds, none of which we have. But this is the Ministry of Finance. We're beginning to articulate this position, but the Ministry of Oil sets the markers here.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the issue of demographics, and we have a question from Ambassador Francis Guy, who is asking about population growth, which in Iraq is one of the highest in the region. So how will you address that as a factor when you are proposing reforms? There are, specific things that one could talk about here when it comes to supporting the youth, which is, a huge proportion of the population, women's empowerment, women's education. Where do these fit within the roadmap for reform?
Well, we mentioned there's quite a significant section in the white paper on demographics and what we should do to control the population. Actually, the numbers are beginning to fall now, so the rate of growth is somewhat slowing down, but it's still, the momentum is still forward. I think everybody has to kick in. Countries that have had a successful sort of population control policies. I mean, we just look at nearby Iran, which also had an exploding population, and then religious authorities and social pressures and women working and so on change the demographics. I think something like that is going to happen here too. I think the government has to take far more proactive role. The role of women in the workplace and so on is changing very slowly in Iraq. But I think that's obviously a very important element in controlling the population. So, I mean, all of these aspects, we can pay lip service to them, but in the end, they require incentives, policies, and changes and what is the ideal family to have. Currently, it's still, there are too many people with families of 7, 10 members and so on. It goes on. But you're hitting a lot of sort of sensitive social and even cultural and religious matters. And without the involvement of the religious hierarchy, it may not succeed at the popular level.
And on a separate note, I have a question from Maria Louise Clausen, who is asking about the decision of the US to withdraw more forces from Iraq, and how you evaluate that, and what is your estimation of the security situation, which I'd like to basically broaden to the new administration coming to the US. What, in your view, this might mean for Iraq?
I think, frankly, I mean, the US presence here has been in the past a force of stability and so on, but it's been drawn down so much in the last few years that its presence is primarily sort of symbolic and tripwire. They're still important in terms of intelligence gathering and in terms of aerial surveillance and so on, which the US can continue either from even a more reduced basis here or from other areas. Qatar. So in terms of the significance of the US presence, it's moved from being sort of essential to stability to being somewhat ornamental, if you want to call it that. Now, this might change if these skirmishes we've had in the last few weeks of Daesh, which unfortunately led to maybe a few dozen people getting killed from the security forces and from innocent civilians. If this escalates, then obviously the figures, the numbers would have to, and their presence would have to be reevaluated. Currently, it's moved to being symbolic, and the response to it is also more sort of for appearances rather than for actual effect, like lobbing a few rockets into the green zone and so on. The new government, I think, or the new administration in America will not abandon completely, I think, the Trumpian approach, especially relating to Iran. I find it difficult to see how they can sort of turn back the time back to 2015, just like that. There are too many domestic reasons why they wouldn't be able to do that. But generally, the trend would be towards de-escalation of tensions with Iran, which should have a positive effect here. May not become a factor in the elections of 2021. Whether Biden will pursue sort of Obama variations of Obama policies, I don't think so, because things have changed since the Trumpian period, and a lot of the changes, a lot of the shifts in policy will not all be reversed. Some might be. So I think there we'll have some kind of hybrid policy driven by new realities on the ground. And I don't think the US, for example, will change the decisions it has made on say, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. It will still be an advocate of Arab countries opening diplomatic relations and so on. But the pressures on Iraq will be much less. So from that point, I think we'll have a kind of breather. The Blinken-Biden plan of 2000, whenever it was, 5 was 7, for partition, I think it's something whose time is gone. It may have been, a useful trial balloon then, but the situation has moved on now. So, it's less sectarian, more raw power politics than before. So that element of it is gone. The KRG central government sort of binary is also changed, because the KRG itself is no longer monolithic. It's already driven by divisions. So it's much more confused, much complicated place than it was in 2007.
Absolutely. And one of the big challenges is, of course, the security sector reform, which is now a big conversation in Iraq. You mentioned that the US obviously has been playing a bit of a role when it comes to security. when can we begin to see reform in the security sector in Iraq, in your view?
I don't know. Is a question relating to the PFM or the Hashid and so on? I think the security issue, I mean, again, the binary is not correct. You know, here you have sort of army good, Hashid bad type of. It's a bit more confused as everything else in Iraq is. The military itself requires a great deal of change and reform, and much more internal stability and cohesiveness, and better. I don't call it leadership, but it has to be much more sort of pulled together than it has in the past. The Hashid elements of it have already sort of been peeled off and gone back home. The other elements of it are becoming less of a direct threat to the stability of governments generally, as they try to find a way of accommodating themselves within the system. I personally think that the Hashid may have to really significantly alter its sort of working arrangements with the government, reduce its potential for being a kind of out of control militia, which it isn't, and to reduce the...
Okay, it seems that we have a network issue, I'm afraid, because we've lost the connection with His Excellency. Unless we manage to get him back online in the next minute, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up the session a little earlier than we expected. We were meant to wrap up at 12 GMT, which is in exactly 6 minutes from now. So if you wouldn't mind, just hold on while we try to reconnect with him. And if we can't get him back online in the next minute or so, then I'm afraid we'll need to wrap up. But in the meantime, I just want to thank everyone for their very good questions and everyone for joining this session. I think everyone will agree that what we heard is a really very frank assessment of the situation in Iraq, and also a rather comprehensive take spanning the economy, politics, and the security situation. So it doesn't look like we're going to get His Excellency back online, I'm afraid. So I just want to thank you again for joining us and thanking His Excellency in absentia. Our next session will begin at 1:30 p.m. GMT, and it will be about empowering youth to shape Iraq's future. So please do come back for that. And you can continue the conversation in the meantime using the chat and networking functions in Conference Plus. Thank you again for joining us, and see you again very soon.